Behind every report in Sage Intacct is accurate and automated real estate data. In this section, what we're going to be discussing is how we can set up things like properties to make sure that we have all of the intel for that property in the system so that we can use those details for onboarding new leases, for reporting, and for setting up accounting functions. And so this is my Columbia Place property. In my Columbia Place property, I have 11 units. Those are commercial units that are retail. I can also see on here when the scheduled charges were first posted, when I onboarded this lease, what I want the lease method to be for start date and end date, again, according to leases and how the property needs to be managed. If I want to track vacancy loss, for example, multifamily properties, if I want to manage straight line rent so that I can handle that deferred revenue. I can also set up different addresses for the property if there's a different invoice address versus an address for the physical property. I can set up square footages. And I do want to point out how important this is because, as we may know, some leases do have requirements around CAMs and recoveries and what square footage method is being used for some of those different recovery processes. This is where I can define that at a property level. Set up default charges for onboarding new leases, set up default deposits, late fees, collect management fees, set up an onboarding checklist at the start of a lease so that I'm able to create a task list, if you will, to make sure everything has been done when I collect that new lease and onboard it. I can also set up taxes and insurance at this level so that I'm tracking that in the system by the property, as well as any attachments. Things like certificates of occupancy, photos, blueprints, whatever the case may be, can all be attached in here to create that single source of truth. Now let's talk a little bit about leases. So when I go in to look at a lease within the Sage Intacct real estate solution, I'm able to see what that lease name is, what tenant or customer that is being charged to, and what units they're renting. In this case, there are actually 2 units that are being rented in a combined space. I have their specific details about their lease commencement, and lease end. I also am able to see different things like attachments, their individual lease that might have been uploaded into the system, any clauses pertaining to their lease that I should be cognizant of. For example, maybe I have in here a first right of refusal or a holdover or a renewal that was executed. What that tenant's level insurance details are so that I can track that and make sure that there's no lapse in coverage and mitigate that risk. Any checklists that I need to do at the start or termination of the lease. Track for deposits that may be held on this particular tenant for those units. Any late fee methods if they happen to pay their rent late. And then finally, I have all of my charges. The system does have the ability for retail type leases to do percentage rents, and you can set up percentage rent calculations on a tiered level so that as we get to different breakpoints, it knows to charge a different percentage based on those retail sales. We do have portals that can be integrated for reporting retail income as well. We also have the ability to come in and do things like reoccurring charges for those types of leases that are gross or even triple net. I can come in and put in what rent detail I want to charge. I can put in if there's any concessions, if there's any recoveries that I want to keep track of within the system. And as I go into some of these rent codes, I do just want to point out that I can have CPI settings built within the system. I can set up what those calculation methods are, import CPI increases, and have that automatically tagged at that lease line item level. I also have the ability, if I do need to manually set up rent increases based on the lease language, what start date those new rent increases need to happen for the step increases. So this is where I can manage a lot of those reoccurring charge details. Also, within the recoveries that I have within here, you'll notice that I have CAM charges. Those CAM charges can be assumed and estimated at the beginning of the year. And as I go in to look at the recovery settings, I have the ability to set up what are the expense codes that I want to have combined to create these CAM charges. And so what's great about this is because this is linked in with your expense solution, because this is set up within Sage Intacct and it has access to the accounts payable bills and the charges within the property, it can go in and pull some of those GL accounts and their activity for that period. When we do our recovery true up every year, you have the ability to say, here's what the estimated recoveries collected were. Here's what the amounts that I spent were. And here's the over or under that I need to identify for each tenant based on the caps that might be set, the percentages, and according to their individual lease language. And so here's just an example of some of those expense categories, whether they were variable or fixed, if there was a manual percent that needed to be identified, a cap, and what GL accounts are feeding into those recovery details.